All right, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation. My name is John Clements, and I'm the technical lead for the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center, or HDIAC, one of three IAC domains in the DoD Information Analysis Centers operating under the Defense Technical Information Center, or DTIC, within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Our informative webinar series highlights current and emerging research and technology developments. It presents an opportunity for accelerating the DoD's leverage of these advancements by increasing awareness and fostering technical collaboration. HDIAC supports those working in the Homeland Defense and Security domains of DoD research and engineering. We do this by helping navigate the vast landscape of scientific and technical information, allowing our customers to get a head start on their technical projects. We provide research and analysis services to help unlock access to information, knowledge, and best practices from government, industry, and academia to stimulate innovation, foster collaboration, and eliminate redundancy. We provide a technical inquiry service in which government researchers, including contractors, can receive 4 free hours of technical research. To learn more about this, just go to hdiac.org and click on the technical inquiries icon, and you'll be able to submit a technical inquiry from there if you would like to. We hope you enjoy this webinar and that it serves for a catalyst for community collaboration and improved DoD Homeland Defense and Security research. Before we begin, I'll just note a couple of administrative items. First, if you're dialed in by phone and would like a copy of the slides, they were posted to the HDIAC webinar announcement. You can go to hdiac.org/webinars and find today's webinar. When you click on it at the bottom of the announcement, it will say View Webinar Slides here, and you can download them from there. Second, all participants are muted, but you can chat with the presenters and moderators using the chat box to the left. However, if you would like to pose a question for the Q&A session we have at the end, please use the audience questions tool at the top center of your screen. It is the icon that looks like a chat bubble with a question mark right next to the emoji icon. At the end of the presentation, I'll go over the Q&A, and for the benefit of those on the phone, I'll make sure I read the question out loud to the presenter. If you have a technical issue during the presentation, don't worry. The full presentation will be available online. Check back on the HDIAC website, and once the webinar is posted, the Go to Webinar button will take you to the YouTube link. With that, I'd like to introduce today's webinar presenter. Gregory Nichols is an HDIAC subject matter expert. Previously, he managed a nanotechnology studies program at ORAU in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where he provided expertise on nanotechnology-related topics and conducted research. Prior to ORAU, he spent 10 years in various healthcare roles, including 5 years as a hospital corpsman in the United States Navy. He has published and presented on a variety of topics, including nanotechnology, public health, and risk assessment. He has a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a master's of public health degree, both from the University of Tennessee, and holds a certified in public health credential. And with that, Greg, I would like to turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, John. I appreciate the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for spending your lunch hour with us today. So as you can maybe hear from my background, I have a great passion in nanotechnology and medicine. So when this opportunity came around, it was just really too good to be true. So we'll talk a little bit about why we're here today. So we have been developing a state-of-the-art report on nanotechnology and combat casualty care. We're kind of about halfway through. We're wrapping up an initial draft, and we thought it'd be nice and beneficial to share this with the community and get some feedback. And so as we go through this discussion today, just a few things we'd like you to keep in mind. Take a look at what we've got. Do you think we're on track? Do you think there's anything we missed? Do you think we covered everything? We'd like to hear that too. If you have any idea for follow-up projects, anything else that we can explore, we'd like to hear your feedback. We obviously have some ideas, but it'd be nice to know what everybody else in the field needs right now. It's a good opportunity to make some networking connections, right? Just ways that we can support the field together, identify any overlaps in other areas where this research is shared. And then I think finally, and most importantly, let's just have fun and share some science and insights together. So the big question when you do these reports is always why this topic and why now? So we've really got two different subjects here, and both of them are very robust in their own right. You know, we got combat casualty care on the one side. We're looking at trauma life support, pre-hospital, combat medicine, specifically for our topic today. And, we spent the past 20 years or so identifying injuries and how do we meet the needs of medical personnel in the field. And now we're shifting from what I kind of think of these wars of the past to the wars of the future, right? We have new technologies, we have new techniques, we have new adversaries. So, what have we learned in the past? What do we need to keep in mind moving forward so that we can have the best trained medical force in the world to address the needs of our operational forces right now? And then on the other side, we look at nanotechnology, right? We're talking about advanced materials research here. We're talking about advanced technology. We know that DoD is very interested in nano, spending about $5 billion in the field since the late 1990s. Nanotechnology has been an integral part of medicine in the past few years, looking at what we call nanomedicine research. DoD has had an interest in investing in that area. And so we are, kind of looking at that overlap, not just DoD, but other relevant areas like the VA, universities, and the private sector that are being funded by DoD to advance this area. And so, what are we trying to achieve with this report? As I mentioned, DoD is already investing quite a lot of time and money in combat casualty care and nanotechnology. We wanted to explore that overlap. Where is DoD investing specifically in nano applications for combat casualty care? Looking at what, if anything, is commercially available or being used in the field. Looking at, what is DoD funding? What other organizations are funding relevant research? We're going to talk about some emerging trends for the near future. Obviously, anytime you have a new technology or you're expanding R&D in an area, you want to look at the limitations and the challenges of implementing the technology. What are some of the holdbacks in terms of what I call the technical side of things, and then also like the social side, right? Looking at health and safety and ethics and legal issues and things like that. And finally, the big question is, what's the payoff? What have we gotten out of this? What's left? What's missing? What's next? A little bit about how we approached developing this report. So we reviewed the current structure of research of these combat casualty care oriented programs, looking at, for example, Army Institute of Surgical Research, JPC6 Combat Casualty Care Research Program. We evaluated peer reviewed and gray literature back to around 2019. This is all publicly available information, Distro A. I'm aware of the fact that there are other research efforts happening, but we kept this all in the public domain. We interviewed subject matter experts in academia, industry, and the government doing relevant work in the field. And then we also utilized some in-house expertise and knowledge. One of the main challenges that we've run across in this report is just a massive amount of information to sift through. If anybody has ever done any research in nanotechnology, there's this vast amount, thousands and thousands and thousands of articles that get published every year, not just in the United States, but abroad. So sifting through all that, trying to figure out what is relevant to this report. Also in medicine and combat casualty care, there's been a lot, of articles in these different core areas that we'll talk about, but just also textbooks and things like that in the field of how you actually approach combat casualty care. So it's just a lot of things that we had to sift through and figure out what is going to be the most relevant. Another thing that's kind of interesting, when we interview people and then also, as you do searches, there's a lot of stuff that, it may be an appropriate solution, but it may not be nanotechnology. It may be hard to tell. Some people kind of lump all advanced technologies into nano, and that's not necessarily true. Some things are what I call big nano. Maybe they're on a very small micro scale, but for the official definition, it may not technically be nano. So the very fuzzy area there was a little hard to differentiate sometimes. I think we did a pretty good job, but you may see some things and you have to kind of squint and say, I'm not sure if that's nano, but maybe it's close enough. So the results, we focused on what is currently being used by DoD or what is realistically possible. What are things that are being developed that are in high technology readiness levels that could be coming out soon? Looking in terms of products and techniques, a lot of this is DoD funded and DoD centric, which makes a lot of sense. We also looked at the literature for things that weren't necessarily advanced technology readiness levels. We wanted to understand what are the trends, right? About 3 to 5 years is kind of the general time frame of things to get researched and then developed and kind of get on to a track towards commercialization. So we want to see, what is currently being done, what is possible, but where is the field heading maybe over the next several years? Because this was such a big report, a very broad set of areas, there's a couple of things in the interest of time that we decided to skip. One of them was looking at nanotechnology, nanomaterials, nanocomposites, and things like that for equipment that could be used in the field. And then the other one was looking at CBRN mitigation. We didn't specifically call that out, but there's so much information in that could be a whole different project. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation today. So before we get going, I thought I would just kind of give you a very brief, very informal summary of my big takeaways from the report, things that we found, things that we got from other people. The first one, if you've done any research in this area, some of you are probably chuckling right now, but everybody wants to make something out of chitosan. Chitosan is a very, very ubiquitous material right now. We'll talk a little bit about this later, but it's being used in almost every area here that we've covered. So very diversified material. Number two, the FDA can be very challenging to work with sometimes. A lot of this comes from the fact that there's a lot of new technologies and emerging technologies. When you get in the beginning of a field like this, there's often a disconnect between research and regulations and what the community needs. So, obviously this would be expected. I think everybody is being patient on both sides. So that was just an observation as we talked to some folks. This one, and number three, I think is probably one of the most important takeaways. Just because you can make it from nano doesn't mean you should. And we'll talk more about that. That's kind of a theme as we go through this report and this presentation. Making things from nano is very difficult. Number five, I think, is important. A lot of you will appreciate this. DoD just needs stuff, right? It doesn't matter how we get there. It doesn't have to be a nano solution. It just needs a solution. If it turns out that nanotechnology offers the best solution, that's great. That's fantastic. We've actually got a couple examples of that we'll discuss, but we don't always have to have an advanced technology solution. And the number six is we'll see some areas are clearly moving along faster than others, and that's to be expected anytime you have advanced technology R&D. So here's the agenda in pictorial form as we go throughout the presentation today. We've already covered the introductory pieces here. The next 5 sections are going to be taken directly from the core content areas of the report. And then finally, we'll have some time to go over a summary, just some final thoughts, and we'll take some time for questions. So we'll go ahead and get into the main part of the report. We're going to start with hemorrhage control and fluid resuscitation. And I think this is probably one of the most appropriate places to start. So you can see here, hemorrhage is the leading cause of preventable death on the battlefield. And this has been something that has been known, since time immemorial. And really what we're trying to do is, there's a broader aspect of blood research and blood substitute research in DoD. And specifically, we're looking at how does nanotechnology affect this research. But overall, there's 3 things that blood substitute research is trying to address. First is the volume issue, right? Blood is made of a lot of different components, plasma being the one that kind of bulks everything up, gives it that volume, right? You need volume for the heart to pump, for the kidneys to filter, for the vessels to maintain pressure, right? Anytime you have some sort of injury, whether it's penetrating trauma or something like that, you're going to have an open system. You're going to bleed out. Obviously, that's a problem. It puts a strain on the body and it causes hypovolemic shock. The other major thing that blood does is it aids in clotting, right? We have platelets, we have other factors. So that's another area that a lot of this research is trying to address. And finally is oxygen transport, mainly because of red blood cells of the hemoglobin that carries oxygen throughout the body. But also, this is a very vital aspect of things because it's not just about perfusing the tissues with oxygen, but hemoglobin also picks up waste from the tissues, primarily CO2, carbon dioxide. So is a very important function that has to happen. So there's a lot of research that's been looking at how do we ensure that this function of blood is also being performed. So we got two of the best technology examples, I think. These have both been DoD funded at some point in their lifespan. On the left, we got Synthoplate, which is developed by Hema Therapeutics. It is a plate-inspired IV injectable drug made of lipid vesicles, basically, loaded with von Willebrand's factor and collagen-binding peptides and some other factors. It actually recreates the adhesion and the aggregation function of real platelets. On the other side, we have erythromer developed by Casualty, which is basically a red blood cell substitute, right? These are these hemoglobin encapsulated molecules with a polymer coating. It allows oxygen to actually be loaded and unloaded when it's appropriate. That was one of the big sticking points in hemoglobin-based oxygen carrier research for a long time, but erythromer seems to have solved that puzzle. So that's a huge step forward. As you can see, both of these are fairly small in size. With erythromer, actually, these particles are 1/50th the size of a normal red blood cell. Emerging trends in terms of hemorrhage control research, we've seen a shift from just trying to mimic the function, for example, just trying to make something that can induce clotting, to something that can actually induce clotting and actually mimic the structure of a platelet. This is one of the core paradigms of biology, right? The structure and function work hand in hand. So we're seeing that more in nanotechnology research related to medicine and other biological trends. This area of hemorrhage control, especially with the nano side, I think has been very clear that all roads are leading to developing a whole blood alternative. That little trophy there, it's not our first place trophy. It's actually supposed to be the Holy Grail, because I think that this is, from what I've gathered and from what others have told me, that this is the Holy Grail of probably all of combat casualty care research, right? Developing a viable whole blood alternative. We've got some things that are on the horizon here that I think are really interesting. We got Desicor that's making a powder dry reconstituted type of solution here. DARPA just recently developed the F-Sharp program to address this idea. Interestingly enough, they didn't specifically ask for nanotechnology solutions, but a lot of what they got were nano-based. And when I talked to the program manager about it, he said, that makes a lot of sense, because the things that we're dealing with these scales of the bio-nano interactions are definitely going to be more likely to be solved with a nanoscale research and solutions than anything else. Some of the challenges, we'll see this theme kind of recur throughout, especially with cost, but this one is kind of interesting because it's not necessarily the cost of the solution. And in a lot of ways, the cost of the synthetic solution is cheaper than a real thing, and that's certainly true for platelets. There's some other things that need some time to develop, biokinetic modeling, for example, and then immune response, what happens after you give repeated doses of Synthoplate or erythromer or something like that. So moving on to the next section, this one is a little more complicated in terms that we don't really have a clear path here. And when I talk to folks about, what is nanotechnology like in the field of wound management, everybody said it's like the Wild West. So I think this really gives a good overview of where we are. In most markets, you have a very clear leader, right? You have one or two companies that own about 80% of the market. When we get to wound products and wound care, it's about the strongest leader, maybe owns about 10% of the market. This is a relatively easy field for people to get into. The FDA has a fairly low bar for developing bandages and things like that, as it does for other types of products. And then also, people are kind of happy with just incremental change in this field, and so sometimes it makes it a little bit easier to just tweak a product to get it out on the commercial market space, tweak it again. So I think that's why we see so many different things. I also think maybe that's why we don't necessarily see a clear path here. So what's happening in this area here? Basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with solutions that could address the 4 different phases of wound healing. And what we see is that there are currently 2 main strategies used in dealing with nanotechnology and healing. First is using materials that have an inherent property that's going to help with the healing. So specifically, we look at something like chitosan that's got really good biocompatibility. It's got some antimicrobial properties. It promotes tissue healing and growth. So that's a good one. And another one that's commonly used is nanoscale silver particles. Silver has been used as an antimicrobial for a very long time. And now that we've got the availability of these nanoscale materials, a lot of them are being incorporated into healing to help with bacterial films and a reduction of other sorts of microbial issues.
Greg, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to point out to a lot of people following either on the phone or having trouble following the slides on their desktop with the platform. So just we're on slide 15 if you're following along on your own. And Greg, if you could call out the slides as you're advancing, that might be helpful.
Yeah, no problem, John. I could do that.
Thanks.
So like John said, we're currently on slide 15. We're talking about emerging trends in wound management. So one thing that we are seeing, and I don't know if this is as clear as maybe some other fields, this is a little bit more anecdotal and kind of reading the tea leaves, but we're seeing a shift from just developing passive dressing, something that's just like a barrier over a wound, to something that's more active, right? It's interacting with the tissue, whether that's through sensing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, or whether that's something that has like time release capsules that are injecting antimicrobial, antibacterial, antibiotics, and things like that into the wound. Things that are actively promoting tissue growth. So some interesting things there. We're also seeing a continued and a growing interest in using chitosan and other biomaterials. Another one that's pretty commonly used is alginate. Alginates and chitosan are used a lot to make nanofibers. There's a process called electrospinning. We can use these materials to create extremely small fibers, and you can make non-woven mats and things like that, which actually make very good substrates for dressings. Moving on to slide 16, talk some about challenges here. As I said, I don't get the sense that there's really a clear unified goal in this area. We kind of see where things are heading, but I don't know if there's really something that makes a lot of sense that everybody says, hey, this is definitely where we're heading. One of the big challenges here, though, is really cost. And then this is one of those examples where most of the time, a nano-based dressing or some sort of wound management tool is going to be much more expensive than something that's more traditional, right? So that's something to keep in mind as we're trying to commercialize stuff. This is also an area where there's been a lot of research on chronic wound management, especially in diabetes care, looking at like cubitus ulcer management and things like that, but not a ton of great applications for combat casualty care. Probably the best one that we have right now is Quick Lock Combat Gauze, which has a kaolin film on it. It's a nanoscale clay, a zeolite, but that was in some of the later generations of this. So that's kind of about it, really. But a lot of this, like I said, is more on the chronic wound management side of things. So moving on, we're going to talk about tissue regeneration now. This is just this title slide, and get to slide 18 is where we get into some of the actual content here. In the report, we do cover some more tissues, not just bone. We talk about skin and we talk about nervous tissue as well. But the bone engineering is really the most advanced area of the field. So we're gonna discuss this pretty much by itself today. So when we talk about bone engineering, what we're trying to do is repair and promote regeneration of the tissue by these 3 different components, right? We're looking at how do we promote cell migration to the area? How do we develop scaffoldings that can be used to bridge the gap of these bone deformities and defects and missing areas, and then also promote cell growth, right? Have a good foundation for cells to grow. And then also the last area is we're looking at biologically active materials. There are a ton of different types of nanomaterials that exist that are very good for this. And so how do we kind of put all 3 of these different things together? So one thing that's really interesting, and I think it makes a lot of sense as to why bone regeneration is one of the bigger areas of nanotechnology research, especially for tissue regeneration. And that's because bone is actually a naturally structured nanocomposite. So it just makes a lot of sense, right? So when we look at the properties of a material or something that would be good for bone regeneration, we're looking at something that's got mechanical strength, something that's biocompatible, and something that's actually going to promote the growth of new bone tissue. And then we've got some good biomaterials that are being used for this right now. Nanobioglasses are becoming more popular in this area, and we've got some other composites as well that we see. Hyaluronic acid is very common as well. So we're on slide 20 right now. We're going to talk about some of the kind of best available technologies right now that we have in this area. So I want to focus on the top one first and talk about New Shores Biosciences. New Shores has the exclusive global license to patented and patent pending bone and tissue regeneration technology that's developed from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And they have had DoD funding over the years to develop this. You can see up on the upper right, that's an example of their new crust scaffolding. It's a controlled porosity polymeric scaffold embedded with smaller amounts of other materials, including hyaluronic acid. What you do is you take this thing and you put it in an area that you need to implant it, and it swells and locks into place, and then it just creates a foundation for all their cells to come and continue to grow. One other thing I want to mention is what the Department of Veterans Affairs is doing. They have the VA BioBone project, which is quite interesting. They're actually looking at how they can 3D print living bone. Right now, they're looking at replacing areas of the mandible, the jaw, where you may have tumors that have to be removed. And they hope to actually get this into clinics within the next 3 to 5 years. So slide 21, for those of you following us, we're talking about challenges. One is high cost. We just see that throughout all of these different areas, right? Anytime you have a nanotechnology solution, especially since the field is still developing, we don't have a lot of robust and mature production and manufacturing capability. So it's still going to be, fairly expensive right now. But also trying to find materials that can match mechanical and biological needs to support bone tissue. Slide 22 and moving into slide 23, we're going to talk a little bit more about neurotrauma, and underneath that, we've included pain control and pain management. So we want to talk about two main goals that we're seeing here in the field, kind of in general, but specific to nanotechnology as well. So one is, how do we detect potential adverse impacts to the brain, right? We have seen this in recent times. Nanosensors are being incorporated into helmets and to other parts of a soldier's uniform to monitor blast pressure and force. And then also there's been a lot of advancements in how we measure blood markers of injury, specifically for traumatic brain injury. The other goal here is, how do we prevent or reduce the impacts of, brain trauma? One kind of major aspect of this is the rapid administration of therapeutics, especially looking at pain management. We'll talk about some interesting trends there. And also, how can we alter an inflammatory response to potentially reduce the impact of TBI? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the emerging trends. Slide 24, we're going to talk about a company called NanoDX as a representative technology of some TBI diagnostics. So you can read a little bit about the company here, but what I think is really interesting is that it's a fairly small machine that has a little cartridge. And you take a blood sample of somebody who has, suffered a potential TBI, and this cartridge has a nanosensor that can detect the presence of these two fairly well-known and connected markers of brain trauma. It give you a result in about 2 minutes, so that's pretty fast turnaround time if anybody's familiar with clinical lab. And the studies have shown that this is actually a fairly reliable test. So I think this could potentially be a game changer for rapid diagnosis of TBI. So some of the emerging trends I kind of alluded to in one of the previous slides, especially on the aspect of pain management. One of the things is, how do you get not just non-opioid based pain medications, but how do you get them to somebody faster? One of the areas that's kind of been taboo for a long time, but now we're looking more into how do we cross the blood-brain barrier. And one of the ways to do that is through the intranasal route. So have a particle that's so small that you can inhale it and it goes directly into the brain. Another thing that I think is just quite fascinating is looking at immune modifying nanoparticles. This is an area of research where at the time of injury, you actually would inject something like some sort of nanoscale polymer, and it creates a decoy. So the immune system, instead of going to the brain and causing additional inflammation, the immune system would attack these other particles, right? So you're drawing the body's response away from the initial injury site, which we think could potentially give the brain some time to heal while the body is busy somewhere else. Move on to slide 26. We'll talk about some challenges here. This area has, I'd say, some moderate bioethical issues that we still need to look through. You know, when you're talking about small particles being inhaled and going right into the brain, you know, that causes some consternation sometimes. So we still have to do a lot of health and safety evaluations for that. Anytime you're talking about the blood-brain barrier, could potentially be dangerous. When you look at nanotechnology research and oncology, this is actually a fairly common research avenue, right? So what lessons can we learn from that field and bring that into combat casualty care? I think that's one of the big questions. So slide 27 and then slide 28, we're going to talk about advanced medical monitoring, starting to wrap up our core content here. So we're seeing two main goals really that are existing in a field. And what we're talking about here is how do we monitor health and then changes in the injured warfighter status, right? We're looking at prolonged field care, en route care, what's the physiological impact that the warfighter is sustaining, and how do we monitor and also actually use that information to treat an injured person. So goal number one is that as things are getting smaller, sensors are becoming more sophisticated, other sorts of networks are becoming more sophisticated, we're actually moving the point of care to the individual himself or herself, right? We're not just talking about having battalion aid stations and things that are closer and closer to the initial site of injury, but actually having diagnostic devices and ways to treat a warfighter and monitor them on their own body themselves. And a lot of this has to do with how we're able to monitor processes happening at the cellular level in real time or near real time. Goal number two, I think, is kind of a broader aspect of maybe combat casualty care, especially when you look at multi-domain operations in that context. But how do we extend the capabilities of field medical personnel, right? How do we improve the continuity of care all the way from the initial site of injury up through, transfer to a military treatment facility in CONUS? And something here that we talk often about with power projection and other aspects of military operations, but not necessarily medicine, but how do we create a force multiplier for medicine, right? And I think that these advanced monitoring capabilities and nanosensors are allowing us to do that. So two current examples I want to talk about that I think are quite interesting. One is Perfusa. They had some initial funding from DARPA, and they developed the sensor. It's about 5 millimeters long, 500 micrometers in diameter. It's a soft, flexible fiber made of a porous gel, and it mimics the environment of cells, and it's embedded, into tissue. And what it does is it emits a fluorescent signal whenever it's in the presence of a biomarker like glucose, lactate, or oxygen. And they actually use this technology to develop a device called LUMI, which monitors oxygen in tissues that have been compromised from peripheral artery disease or chronic wounds. And it's actually been CE marked for use in Europe, and it's currently under investigational use by the FDA. Another company I want to talk about is Legionarius. They've developed these smart garments that are loaded with biosensors, and they actually can alert medical personnel remotely to where the injury has occurred in the warfighter, and can even apply compression to the area of injury, right, to control hemorrhage without a person actually being there. So one of those ways to extend the capabilities of medical personnel in the field. So move on to slide 30, where we'll talk about emerging trends in this area. One thing that's fairly clear in the report, we didn't necessarily touch on it too much here, but graphene has become a very popular substrate for sensors. Not necessarily that it's replacing silicone, but it's becoming a lot more easier to work with and more interesting to explore. There's been a lot of work with implantable sensors. We see this a lot in diabetes care with glucose monitoring, but maybe we're going to get to the point where we see this with other biomarkers as well. Another thing that's kind of been interesting for a long time, pretty much all of our diagnostic tests have been based off of blood. Blood is still the gold standard, but it's difficult to get, right? You have to draw blood, you have to do other things and monitor, run it in these giant machines and things like that. So anything that we could do to use other body fluids makes it a little bit easier to monitor and diagnose. And so there's been a big trend now that we've got these smaller sensors to be able to detect analytes and sweat and interstitial fluid. And then I think these last two are really quite interesting, kind of go hand in hand in some ways. Nanotechnology is allowing us to develop more flexible electronics, and we can make smart fibers and we can weave them into textiles, something like what Legionarius is doing. There's been a lot of research funded by MIT, supported by MIT in this area. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But also another trend is looking at these self-powering nanosensors. We've done some research in the past looking at energy harvesting systems and nanogenerators for combat equipment, but this is kind of neat to see this in a field where people are developing biosensors that can power themselves, right, through turboelectric or piezoelectric means. So slide 31, we're going to cover some challenges here. Again, we've got some ethical issues, especially with implantable sensors. If you're continuously monitoring a biomarker, you're also continuously sending a signal. So what does that mean in terms of privacy, not just data security, but finding location of a warfighter, right? So that could potentially have some concerns. Bandwidth is a big issue, right? If you got lots of devices sending lots of signals, it's going to get very crowded, right? You're competing with other operational pieces as well. So as we move more to the multi-domain operation concept of having autonomy and AI and robotics and more data, that's great. But how do we make sure that we're going to have enough room, when you get to electromagnetic frequencies and stuff like that, to monitor all this stuff? And finally, in terms of practicality, when you're continuously monitoring a person's physiological status, the sensors are going to be embedded there for quite some time. So we need to ensure that they're rugged, that they can perform in extreme cold and extreme heat and humidity. They also, require not just the ability to be transmitted, but if you're trying to identify where a person is, you need GPS. And we know that there are places in the world where you have GPS denied environments, you have various terrain. So that could also potentially be a challenge when you're looking at monitoring. All right, so I'm actually right on time for my time marks. I feel pretty good about that. So we're going to be wrapping up here and talk about some of the trends that we've seen overall and just kind of give you a 50,000 foot view of the whole presentation. So thank you for hanging in there. Basically, you hung in there so you get to this point. So hopefully I painted a picture for you as kind of brief as it has been. But this is kind of a wrap up of everything we covered and where we think the field is right now. You see on the left, these are the 5 areas that we covered in the core part of the report. The middle column covers the possibilities that we have right now, right? These are things that we can do with nanotechnology. These are things that we're focusing on when it comes to combat casualty care. So these are very possible. And on the right is where I think we're heading, where other experts think we're heading, where the field, the data, the literature is saying that we're heading. So hopefully you can kind of see how we make that leap. But you look at like hemorrhage control, for example, we had to spend some time to develop platelets and develop synthetic oxygen carriers and other things. And so now that we can do that, now we're looking at how do we put all that research together, right? And make whole blood, for example. Couple of things that I want to mention just briefly. When we talk about some of the additional tissue regeneration, I mentioned that there's a little bit more happening in the field beyond bone. There's some recent research at Northwestern University where they've actually been looking at some hydrogels that have nanofibers in them. They've done some experiments where they've had mice with spinal cord injuries, and they've injected this gel into the spinal cords, and actually has kind of bridged that gap and promoted some healing on the spinal cord. So that's been a pretty good development. And then looking more at the advanced medical monitoring, talking a little bit more about these advanced fibers and things like that. As I mentioned, DoD has funded a lot of research through MIT Institute for Nanosoldier Technologies and things like that, looking at how you can make more advanced garments that could detect things in real time, that can measure heart rate and things like that. So some interesting developments there. Slide 34, just want to share some universal trends that we've noted. These are things, beyond just the very specific area that we've covered. We talked about trends in each one of those areas, but just kind of globally, as nanotechnology applies to combat casualty care, and even in the field of nanotechnology overall, first we're seeing a shift towards convergence, right? This idea that things aren't necessarily in a silo, especially in science. There's a lot of overlap. And as you look at nanotechnology, there was a long time we were just making nanomaterials, but now we're kind of looking at how do we integrate that with biomaterials? How do you have nanoscale biomaterials? How do we 3D print nanomaterials? How does the Internet of Things integrate? And I think you're seeing some of that with the sensors that I mentioned. So all of this stuff is coming together now, right? It's not so easy to say this is nanotechnology because it's getting pretty fuzzy. The second is that we're seeing this paradigm shift, and I kind of mentioned this in the beginning. DoD just needs solutions, right? The early days of nano research, not just with DoD, but throughout the whole enterprise, people wanted to know what could be done, what was possible in nanotechnology. So we were specifically asking for nanocentric solutions. But now we're looking at solutions, and a lot of them may happen to be nanotechnology, right? Because what we're trying to do, that advanced functionality, is just more possible with nanotechnology than it used to be before. A couple other things I'm not going to get into necessarily, but you can see some of the trends that we're heading towards. And one other trend I want to mention that we don't have here, but I think is very important, and this kind of goes to that broader aspect of nanotechnology, but nanotechnology, nanomaterials are being rolled up into the whole class of advanced materials, right? So it may be getting a little bit harder to just pull out specific engineered nanomaterial solutions, because I think we're going to see more of that aspect of advanced materials. Also, there's a lot more interest, a lot more possibilities in the nanobio interface, especially when you get into medicine and physiology. A lot of things happen on the nanoscale anyway, right? So it makes a lot of sense that you start to see nanotechnology and biotechnology converge. So I think we're seeing more of that, and things head in that direction. Slide 35, I just wanted to go over some universal challenges that we've noted, combat casualty care, nanotechnology, and the overlap of those two. So one of the big challenges, how do we translate nanoscience into treating combat wounds of the future? We've done a great job over the past 20 years of understanding new injuries, especially if they arose from new challenges on the battlefield, right? But how do we take all that research and how do we learn from it? How do we apply it to what's coming next, right? There's a couple things that I think we can discuss in here as well. So we look at new injuries from new weapons, right? What about directed energy, kinetic weapons, things like that? How can nanotechnology be used to address those needs? Old injuries from old weapons, right? Artillery is something that we're seeing used more, right? U.S. forces haven't really faced artillery barrages since Korea. So what happens as we move to new types of battlefields where maybe old weapons are being used again? Like I mentioned in the beginning, one thing we didn't cover in this report, but I think it's very important to cover, and looking at how nanotechnology can be used to mitigate CBR threats, how we can use that in a response. So there's a lot of research and development in this area, and I think that could easily be a completely separate report or project. One of the things, talk to some folks, and we all kind of agree, you don't want to over-engineer a solution, right? And it kind of goes back to, just because you can make something out of nano, it doesn't mean you have to. And that goes hand in hand with that next piece of how do we do a better job of using nanotechnology appropriately. I was reading an article talking about how do we take lessons learned and prepare, specifically, this was about Army medics, for being able to address, new injuries in the field and make sure you got the right tools at the right time and things like that. And this was a great quote. In the article, it says, you don't want to bring a fully loaded sedan if you don't need it, right? So how do we make sure that we're getting the right solutions, the right research, the right technologies into medical personnel at the right time? And a couple other things. I'm a health and safety guy, so I always think about these things, but safety and ethical issues that we still need to be addressed with nanotechnology as we move into, future solutions. And then finally, what lessons learned from nanotech applications in other fields of medicine can be brought to combat casualty care, and how do we do that? Specifically, when you look at wound management and tissue regeneration, there's a lot of research with diabetes care. How can that chronic wound management be brought back into acute care? Oncology, right? There's a lot of research, especially with nanotherapeutics and drug delivery systems. How can that be brought to the battlefield? And one other that we've noticed that's not necessarily mentioned here, but neurology and neurosurgery. There's a lot of research using nanotechnology to address MS and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So how can that research translate to traumatic brain injury? So with that, I just want to thank everybody for hanging in there today and joining us. And I also want to just acknowledge these folks that helped me, kind of guide me through the report, helped me develop parts of it. I want to thank Joel Hewitt, one of our SMEs here at HDIAC, who's given me a little bit of advice and been a sounding board throughout this. I want to thank Lauren Shelby, who's our graduate intern from the University of Tennessee. She's done a fantastic job. And also Deanna Melodis, who's a researcher with service engineering, who's really helped a lot, been an integral part to developing of this. And so thank you again, and I will take some questions now.
All right, sounds good. Thanks a lot, Greg. That was a tremendous presentation. We do have a few questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on that. First one came from me, actually. Just kind of question when you were talking about IMP. Could diverting blood from the brain through an IMP actually reduce healing or deprive oxygen, and is there research countering that? And by that I mean countering for that potential.
Well, that's a great question, John. I would probably have to do a little bit more research to get back to you on that. My initial reaction is anytime you're shunting blood away from the brain, it's not necessarily a good thing, but I would have to do a little bit more research and get back to you.
That's good. The next question comes in from Vincent Quinterno. Is testing ongoing with humans? If so, what and how does one get considered to participate in these studies?
That's an excellent question. There are some clinical trials underway for some of the nanopharmaceuticals, I believe so. I don't know how you necessarily get involved. NIH runs all of the clinical trials in the country. I know you can go to, I think it's clinicaltrials.gov, and see what's actively happening. I don't know if that's an avenue to enroll or not, or to oversee a study, but that's where I would start. You can always just maybe email me, and we can talk a little bit more offline about this.
From Joel Hewitt, for synthetic blood alternatives, how does their shelf life compare to natural fluids?
Wow, that's a great question, Joel. So in the real world, natural platelets have a shelf time of about 5 days. And red blood cells and whole blood have a shelf life of around 30 to 40 days. Looking at their synthetic alternatives, everybody's trying to basically create something that's a dry powder that can be reconstituted later in the field. And so when you do something like that, the shelf life goes from months to years, depending on what underlying technology you're using to preserve that material.
All right, and then that concludes the questions. There was one toss in, not a question, but from Mark Dodge. Thank you for hosting this event today.
Thank you, Mark.
You are very welcome, sir. And I don't see. Oh, we do have one more question that just popped in. Let me just take a look. This is actually a very good question, and it's germane to something that I was recently working on. Working military dogs play a vital role in supporting special ops missions. Is nanotech being leveraged to advance battlefield care for force multipliers? And this comes from Al Brzezinski.
Al, thank you very much. So you've opened up another project that we could explore together if you'd like. But this is something, I neglected to mention. We didn't look at canine medical research in this report, although a lot of the research that's ongoing in humans has direct applicability to military dogs, working dogs, special forces. I think that's something that we would love to explore a little bit more. I see somebody just wrote something about arrhythmia working on a canine solution. So the answer is yes, but there's probably a lot more research here that we could explore.
Yes, and in addition to that, we have somebody who also mentioned that the blood substitute products, Synthoplate and Arrhythmia, are still preclinical and a couple years from clinical trials, so they won't be listed on clinicaltrials.gov yet. Stay tuned. So,
Yeah,
and that's why we do these webinars. We bring together people who are researching and so many subject matter experts that can weigh in and help the community in that way. So thank you to who posted that, Elaine Haynes. Thank you very much, ma'am. I'll just pause here for a few seconds to see if any additional questions pop in. And while we're waiting, I will point out, as Greg mentioned, he is working on a state-of-the-art report for HDIAC. Still a couple months away from publication, but that was the genesis for this webinar. So that will be published and distributed by HDIAC probably late in the summer by the time it's published. And additionally, if you want more info on the topic, I did put Greg's email address in the chat. It is simply gregory.nichols@keylogic.com. But you can always, if you need to get in touch with Greg, you can reach out to HDIAC. Just email contact@hdiac.org. I don't see any other questions, but Greg, this was a great presentation. You kind of set the bar for future presentations to meet. So thank you very much. As I said, this will be posted online, both on YouTube and MilTube within probably about the next 24 hours. So if you want to share this around the community, please do so. We encourage that. But thanks again, Greg.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the invitation. It's been a pleasure.